It's 10 a.m. in Washington and 7 a.m. in San Francisco, where President Biden starts his day. He's facing both criticism and support over his warning to Israel that the U.S. would withhold weapons if it invades Rafah. Some prominent Republicans were critical, including Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, while some progressives welcomed the stance. Joel Payne and Kevin Sheridan join us now. Joel is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Kevin is the former Republican National Committee spokesperson. Kevin, let me just ask you, a lot of the Republicans that are criticizing President Biden are the same Republicans who were withholding aid to Israel over issues having to do with the border. And I sort of wonder, the fact that Joe Biden, over the course of the entirety of Israel's operations in Gaza, has expressed his support for the Israelis and for rooting out Hamas, this one thing is enough for people to say that he's not serious about his support of Israel and Bibi?
Well, Republicans and Democrats did come together and passed it for Israel, and that, and Biden signed it. So now he's withholding it, and he's just going to extend the war if he doesn't give them the weapons they need. So politically, it's a disaster for him. Israel's support is by a huge margin popular among voters, and geostrategically, it's just going to extend the war that he wants to come to an end. And if that goes through the summer and into the election, that's not good for him, right? There's going to be massive protests in Chicago. He's going to just continue to stoke the base that wants to see a total pullout of Gaza and no future military action in Gaza. So I don't get what he's doing here. He's not going to be able to placate the small minority of pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine voters that are making noise on college campuses. I think he should just stick with his support of Israel, give them the weapons they need.
So, Joel, let's talk about this sort of threading of the needle that the president has been trying to do, support Israel, reinforce the enduring ironclad support for Israel, while also trying to apply some pressure to the government there and in terms of protection for civilians in Gaza and that sort of thing. General H.R. McMaster was here earlier, and he felt that this move to halt the delivery of some of those bombs was pandering because those weapons probably most likely wouldn't have been used on Rafah anyway. What's your response to that?
Well, I think my response is that the president was responding to a lot of different factors. One, he knows that the United States does have a responsibility to support an ally who is defending themselves. And I don't think the president's ever said that he quarrels with Israel defending itself. What he quarrels with is Israel recklessly going into dense civilian populated areas without a clear plan for how to protect those who might be in harm's way and an exit strategy. And I think the reason why progressives were heartened to see the president shift his stance a bit this week is because it finally seems like there's some leverage that's being applied to our partners over in Israel. And I think that if the president continues to ride this balance of supporting an ally while also encouraging them to be responsible as they defend themselves, I think that the president will be able to strike the right tone, not just morally, which is most important, but politically. And I think that this was an important turning point in the president mending some fences within his political coalition this week.
Kevin, let me switch gears now. Actually, Joe, let me ask you first before I go to Kevin. Trump is sitting in a Manhattan courtroom. Meanwhile, the Biden campaign, which has a pattern of getting out on the road, ramping its events and announcements on Wednesdays, that's something that they do. And the president, the former president, is going to be in a courtroom. The current president is going to be taking attention away from Donald Trump. The question, of course, is that enough to galvanize his base and perhaps even independents, the fact that he's on the campaign trail and Trump is sitting in a Manhattan courtroom?
Look, there's no doubt that Joe Biden has an advantage with Donald Trump being restricted with his campaigning schedule during the duration of this trial. And I think the president is smartly using his time. Kevin knows this. The one resource that is irreplaceable on a campaign trail is time. And President Biden has more of it to devote to winning over and persuading voters, reminding voters of the stakes. And I think he's going to continue to do that. It's not surprising that he's ramping up his schedule. I think you'll continue to see him do that. And then I think the onus will be on Donald Trump to figure out when he does have time in his schedule, how is he using that? Like, I know there's this frame about Donald Trump not having time to campaign. That's accurate. But when he is campaigning, I don't think he's doing it particularly effectively. He's not campaigning like he did in 2016, talking about, working class issues, things that really opened him up to a different population of voters. He's complaining about grievance and about his own personal legal challenges. And I think regardless of how much time Donald Trump has on a campaign trail, if he doesn't use it more wisely, I think that Joe Biden is going to, over the course of time, have a greater advantage as the summer drones on and as we get towards the fall.
Well, this past Wednesday, when the president was out campaigning, Donald Trump chose to spend his time with donors, because what he's also sort of running out of is money, right? So that's what he chose to do, which is part of the reason why President Biden was getting a few more headlines this Wednesday. But Kevin, I want to ask you about something else. House Speaker Mike Johnson is still holding on to the gavel after a failed vote to oust him, presented by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'm curious about how you interpret this now. Is this kind of underlying or highlighting the rift between Republicans in the House, or the fact that so many Republicans voted to keep him in that position? Does this signal a healing amongst Republicans?
I think it signals enough is enough. I think a vast majority of the caucus has had it with these tactics, and Marjorie Taylor Greene can go out there and try this. She failed. She's now going to fundraise off of it, which is small dollar gold for her. That's her game. She's playing the outside game, and I think the vast majority of the caucus, though, is saying, "Look, we've got serious things to do. We're trying to, keep this House and get into election season here. We're not doing this again." So that's why you saw them.
Let me ask you something. Yeah. Kevin, I want to ask you something else about, it's been reported in the Washington Post and other outlets that Donald Trump, when we're talking about fundraising and money and campaigning, was sitting around with a bunch of oil executives and basically said, they were
Raise
complaining.
$1 billion for me.
They were complaining that the oil lobby has pumped billions of dollars into the Biden administration. And Trump basically said, give me $1 billion. And when I become president, I'll roll back all of these regulations that Biden has put into place. Now, that's not illegal, right? But it does speak to, this is what I want to ask you about, because I read something in The Atlantic that was interesting, which is that most Americans know that that's how the game is played. Yeah. And a lot of Americans know that's how the game is played because of Donald Trump. He came onto the scene in 2015 saying, all of these people in Washington take money from special interest groups. I don't need the money because I'm a billionaire. So I can do this and I'm going to do it for you. That's the pitch to the American people. But I wonder, in exposing sort of the naked corruption, even if it's not illegal, what does that say to you about the current state of how Washington and in particular the Republican campaign, because he is the leader of the party, the Republican Party, Donald Trump is playing it so nakedly?
Yeah, Donald Trump always breaks the third wall, and he says what we all know it to be true. But look, that's not a surprise. Look what he did for oil prices and drilling and pipelines and opening up restricted areas in Alaska and everything else he did. But he brought down prices and he kept them low. Right now, Americans are struggling with $4 or $5 gas in some places. It's very high all over, and it's a real strangle on the American economy. So, look, the green energy lobby is going to give $1 billion to Joe Biden. The oil guys will probably give to both. That's no secret, but yeah, that's just Donald Trump reading the stage directions once again.
But Joe, let me ask you your reaction on. Yeah, Joe, I want your reaction because on one hand, it sort of exemplifies what we all know about Donald Trump, which is transactionalism, but it has nothing to do with people, because what he's implying is if you don't give me the money, then I'm not going to roll back these regulations.
Yeah, that's right, Vlad. That's exactly what I was going to say. So this gets to my point earlier. What made Donald Trump, albeit if you disagree with him, somewhat effective in the early part of his most recent stint as a political actor is that people thought that he was taking his power, his skill set, whatever you think it is, and applying it to making their lives better. If people don't make that relationship, that's going to be a problem for Donald Trump, someone who is already unpopular and someone who people already think of as not the most honest actor. If people don't think he is applying that guile, whatever you want to call it, towards making their lives better, that's going to ultimately be something that's going to come up short for Donald Trump. And so this example of him encouraging people to give money to him as opposed to to Joe Biden, I think is a good example of that. If he's making that argument from a standpoint of, hey, I want to lighten the load on American families, that's one thing. But if it's just give me money, I think that voters are smart enough to see the transactional nature of that and the fact that they aren't the center of that transaction.
All right, Joel, Kevin, thank you.
Thank you.